Roughly 85 years ago, one of the world's most well-known movies hit theaters, and it's still to this day, when you adjust for inflation, the world's most profitable or biggest box office movie, which is Victor Fleming's Gone with the Wind. I made it a personal mission today, since it's a movie I haven't probably seen in years or nor could remember, and it was in theaters for the 85th anniversary, to go into the movie, watch it, and come out with my own personal thoughts and own personal reviews on it. Because not only is this a movie that's going to be well known for all the records that it has, Academy Award wins, and more, but it also has a lot of controversy to it in terms of how we look back at it with time. And I think there's a lot to be going on, and there's a lot of conversations to have about this movie, and just my own personal feelings about what I think its quality is. But before we get started too much on my review, there's no better way to start this than to actually qualify what some people would be considered the main controversy. And that is that Gone with the Wind is a movie that, even for its time in the 1940s, probably sends the wrong message to what the Old South was like. HBO Max, about a year or two ago, had taken it off and put it back on the service. And even before the movie we saw today, there was a major disclaimer in front of it that Warner Brothers had, which that means Gone with the Wind is a product of its time and depicts some of the ethnic and racial prejudices that have, unfortunately, been commonplace in American society. They were wrong then, and they were wrong now. And it basically condemns what I think is one of the darker aspects of this movie. And I know there's a lot of people out there who have their own opinions on the Civil War and everything that happened in that place. But when you go through history, and even when you watch this movie, it's very clear that they're idolizing the Old South type method. No better proof of this is through the kind of beginning opening crawl quote that we get, where there was a land of cavaliers and cotton fields called the Old South. Here in this pretty world, gallantry took its last bow. Here was the last ever to be seen of knights and ladies fair, of master and of slave. Look for it only in books, for it is no more a dream remembered, a civilization gone with the wind. And what is annoying in some aspects, a lot of ways, and which should have been seen and dealt with, and kind of was in some parts at the time, even going as far back as the 1930s and 40s, when this movie was really at its peak in theaters, is the line of the last kind of lines of, here was the last ever to be seen of knights and their ladies fair, of master and of slave. Look for it only in books, for it is no more than a dream remembered, a civilization gone with the wind. That is a pretty cringe quote to come from the beginning of the movie. And even at points throughout this movie where characters like even Rhett Butler in some cases, and there's some characters who make comments like Ashley Wilkes mentioning he would maybe free his slaves, there is this weird connotation that the South was this very honorable and somebody, a rootable type individual part. And I think it's something that, as America, it divides a lot of people. But I think when you just look at the plain facts and what's happened, and there's a lot of people who will say it's the Civil War was about some states' rights, and there is merit to that. But the main state right they cared about was the right to own slaves, and you see it in this movie. And I'll give Gone with the Wind a bit credit there. Is when you watch the first act of the movie, of this very long movie, they're talking about how they might be going to war with the Yankees, and how they need to protect the right to keep their slaves and stuff like that. And it's present in the movie, and it doesn't deny the fact that slavery was, in my, not even my opinion, just facts wise, even when you look at like some of the states that seceded their constitution, slavery was very much the main root and right that the South wanted to keep during the Civil War. So Gone with the Wind kind of glorifies that old South type feeling. And what's sad about that in some ways is that there's actually, I think, a pretty great story and tragedy when it comes to Scarlett O'Hara and her character throughout. Now, again, I'm not going to go too much commenting more on the controversial with the racial tones and kind of the idolizing of what really was a cruel and horrible area. That even when this movie was coming out, people like Hattie McDaniel, who won an Academy Award for this amazing performance as Mammy, she wasn't able to attend the premiere. She wasn't able to be with her cast at the Academy Awards. There were still extreme segregation laws that were driven by kind of the hate and the belief that you can even see in this movie. And I just think it's important, and even in modern days, to look back and condemn that and say, we can't use the excuses that was the times, because everywhere else in the world was getting ahead of that. And then this was something that was a stain on the Americas, and it still kind of can be a stain. Not to say that racism isn't a thing across the world. It very much is. I recommend watching the movie Origin when it hits streaming to really go into that idea. I think that is a great movie, and even a book, I forget what the book is named, that it's based off of. But people back then should have seen these issues ahead of time. And when we say things like product of its time and things were different back then, I feel like we're just excuse making for people to glorify individuals who shouldn't be glorified today. Okay. Preaching aside, why was I saying that this is a kind of good rooted story in here? Well, because our main character, played brilliantly by Vivien Leigh, Scarlett O'Hara, depicts a young woman at that time period dealing with both what a role of a woman was like back then and the ups and downs of life. And you saw this transformation of this sweet, young, innocent child who, had a certain love for somebody and wanted to do whatever she could to get that love with them, turn into a very self-centered, ego, and just terrible person overall. And you're left in a tragic state that when she finally realizes what she's been doing all these years has been like toxic and just overall the wrong way to go about things, it's too late. The monster was already made, and it already had its impact across everybody she knows. And the highs and lows of this story, I do think, is a very interesting and great story concept when you aren't being, subject to the time period and what may be glorified in the first and somewhat of the second half of this movie. Clark Gable as Rhett Butler, I think, gives a great performance, and Rhett Butler ends up being a character who kind of has that more modern take and feel. He denounces the idea of war, basically telling members of this, around Scarlett O'Hara's area that you don't want to go to war because you will likely lose this war, and all you're going to bring is death and bodies. But even still, at the end of the first half of the movie, he kind of has a shift to where now he wants to join the Confederate Army, that he's ready to, die in arms with them. And I think I get his reasonings for that, but it took a character that has such an interesting other moral compass and a much more, what I would say, opposite feeling side than what you get for most of the Southern characters, that when he kind of went that way, he lost his charm a bit. But still, Clark Gable gives this terrific performance of this very eccentric, womanizing man who is very intelligent for his time, but also very brash and quote unquote unhonorable. Paired with that, as a foil to Scarlett through the whole movie, is Melody Hamilton, the woman who actually did marry her love of Ashley Wilkes. And Melly is a character throughout that is like just the nicest person in the world. She treats wounded soldiers and all the time. She is always there for Scarlett when Scarlett is doing some pretty terrible things. And even on her deathbed, at the end of the movie, she calls to Scarlett first because she knows that Scarlett cares about Ashley, and Scarlett was there for her mainly because of Ashley during, Melanie's big time of need when she was pregnant and having her first child. And I just thought Olivia I don't know how to say her last name, Olivia de Havilland just did an amazing job portraying this character, and it was such an important part of this story to understand all the negative aspects to Scarlett O'Hara, to have Melody Hamilton be at that side. As far as who I thought was the biggest standout in terms of every time they were on the screen, it gave me smiles based off of their acting skills. It's Academy Award winner Hattie McDaniel as Mammy. Now, Mammy is a character I wish there was written more nuance in there. She is a slave slash ex-slave of Scarlett O'Hara's family, and she kind of stays blindly loyal to them throughout. And yes, there's sometimes that's very much the case when it comes to there were slaves that just ended up working and being a part of the people who owned them previously. But the way Scarlett treated Mammy was so disrespectful throughout the whole entire movie. But Mammy truly did care, and just her quick-witted lines, her very bold brashness to say what was on her mind. Hattie McDaniel steals every scene that she's in. And even though she's a character that I think highlights the biggest controversies parts of the movie, I do think the way that you can see it, I think you understand the negative sides of Scarlett's character when you look at it, I think, with a more sophisticated eye. There's a great scene near the third quarter of the movie where Rhett says, he wants to start, him and Scarlett just married, having so much wealth. He wants to start treating Mammy with more things, out of respect, out of thanks for everything Mammy has done for Scarlett and Rhett over the years. And Scarlett had this horrible, horrible comment of like, oh, she doesn't deserve to have any of that. As if like somebody who's been with your family at the highest of highs and lowest of lows doesn't deserve your love and respect enough to have some of the nice things that you're collecting around you. It just really lended yourself to understanding that Scarlett was turning into this very despicable monster and a very selfish human being that really is a tale of greed and why you shouldn't be greedy in life. Again, whether this was an intention of the actual movie or not, that's for Victor Fleming and Margaret Mitchell to talk about in time. But for me, that's how I came out of this movie. Gone with the Wind is a very big tale of greed and egotism and selfishness taking over in a negative way. Now, in the first half of the movie, I think we see Scarlett coming to her character, and when she hits her lowest point, she probably hits her highest point as an individual. The whole entire scenes around Atlanta, as it's being sieged and as it's falling, were tremendously great action scenes and things that I can see brought people back into the theaters. Because when you think about the 1940s, like this had modern blockbustery type feels and vibes when it comes to getting out of Atlanta, everything going on there, that city being kind of razed to the ground during Sherman's March era. And it really was thrilling. It reminded me a lot of Titanic, I feel, when the Titanic kind of starts sinking. I think there's elements of this movie that you can see can influence modern storytelling and modern movies that succeed so well. And that's why I think it's so interesting to go back and watch it. And, at this time when Scarlett gets back to her house, saving Sissy, saving Mellie and her son, you see her do these heroic things, and she has nothing when she gets back. Her home has been ransacked. Her mother had just recently passed away. All of their slaves, besides the 2 house workers, had left. And it's just been her lowest point as an individual in terms of success. But as an individual, as a character, it's her highest moment, because not only did she just help give birth to Melanie and her child, she was able to successfully get them out of Atlanta, to get them someplace safe where they were able to get healthy again and grow. She was working cotton fields and stuff to be able to try and get food into her family's mouth. Scarlett O'Hara's and her drive really showed the positive nature as an individual at the end of the first half of this movie, right before the intermission. And when she has that kind of iconic quote line of saying, "I will never be hungry again. I will never be like this again." It's one of those just interesting commentary scenarios of somebody sometimes at their lowest point in terms of what's around them monetarily can be at their highest point when it comes to who they are as a person. In the second half of the movie, we see Scarlett go down a treacherous road. Not just, after her first marriage, trying to get back at Ashley with an individual who did pass away, she ends up marrying somebody that was kind of supposed to be wed to her sister, just so that she can take advantage of his money situation. And again, you can see eventually when that husband does end up dying, kind of in a retribution act for Scarlett herself. She isn't grieving the fact that she had just lost her husband. She's kind of grieving the fact that she's starting to realize that she is kind of a monster. That, it was her words and her encouragement that sent him to go after the people that had roughed her up on her ride back to the mill. It was her inhibition of wanting the money to pay off taxes to marry a man that wanted to marry her sister since the beginning of the movie. She is becoming the selfish character, but then she unfortunately commits to sometimes an even more selfish character, Rhett Butler. And Rhett and Scarlett's relationship I can best relate to is, if somebody has ever watched House, is the House and Cuddy relationship. They were great to watch when they weren't dating, when they were teasing each other, when they are will they won't they per se. But once they commit to each other, once they get married, all those toxic tendencies both have, especially on Scarlett's side, come out, and you get this horrible, horrible marriage where, they do have a daughter per se, but that daughter is the only thing that's keeping Rhett around, and Scarlett is just shutting herself out in the movie. And again, she's chasing the stream of being with Ashley Wilkes, her love from the very beginning of the movie, and she's chasing the stream as wealth. And that's been one of the main reasons why she married Rhett Butler, because he knew he was a millionaire that dealt with sales across, the different parts of the world. And you see them build up this lavish lifestyle. And that's when you get the quote when Rhett's like, we should try giving something nice to Mammy because she's been with us and been with you during the highs and the lows. And Scarlett's like, she doesn't deserve that. She hasn't earned that. She's, and it's just like, selfishness could not be ever so high. She's an individual that has more money and more wealth and more things than anybody could ever need, and yet she's still wanting more and more and more and more, and she's sacrificing the relationships of not just her daughter, but of her husband and everybody else around her. By the end of the movie, the only person I think that is truly there caring for Scarlett O'Hara is Melanie Hamilton, and she had just passed away at the end. Rhett decides to leave, and Scarlett is kind of left realizing that she has this big, glorious house, all this money, but, she had just lost her daughter. She has now lost Rhett Butler. Mammy will likely be with her, to be supportive of her because that's the character they've written Mammy as. But outside of that, she's probably alienated most of her family, and she's got nothing emotionally. And it's just a tale of telling you that money doesn't buy you happiness. That that doing the things around you that'll make people happy will make you kind of your best individual. And chasing yourself to be not just a better person is important, but just chasing it for the wrong reasons can lead to you having an empty shell of a life later on in life. And when I think of Gone with the Wind, that is part of the message I'm going to bring through. This is a tragic tale of a young woman who was very brash and bold for her time, that did wonderful and incredible things, but her want of more and greed of more hauled her out from the inside and left her emotionally with very little around her. And as far as the controversial things, those are completely valid and I think should always be mentioned and confronted and condemned when we talk about not just this movie, but just in general this time period. There's a big issue whenever it comes in our country of the US that we still let people idolize and make excuses on why people should idolize the South. But it's 2024 now. It's almost 150 years since the Civil War, since we tried to free slaves. Even been longer than that. We're coming up on 160 years. And the fact that we still allow these type of tendencies to be defended in public is sad, because even living here in Idaho, just up north in northern Idaho, there was the Utah women's basketball team saying that they had racism thrown at their way when they were in Coeur d'Alene. And as somebody who lived not that far away from Coeur d'Alene and who I've known people who lived in northern Idaho, I can tell you racism there does exist and still happens on the daily, most likely. It was probably the most racist part of the country I've ever lived around. And I've only really lived in Pennsylvania, southern parts of Idaho, and Washington State. But I can only imagine if that is a snippet of what the South may feel like for some people. That was not okay. And again, when it comes to condemning the past stuff, we can't make excuses of that was the time. We can't keep making excuses it was states' rights. Slavery was wrong, and we shouldn't be using any symbolism from that time period as a positive or as something we should look up to and reinforce. And it's just my opinion. It's just what I think we should be as a country. And I think it's just the right, it's the way to move forward, because there's nothing to gain from glorifying individuals that were fighting to keep their rights to own individuals as slaves. And on a more positive note of an overall review, Gone with the Wind does hold up very well as a tragic romance timepiece where you see a young lady become a strong woman into a hollowed out, selfish individual. And if there's anything that can be seen from this is how much it influenced modern movie making with its romantic wit, with its high dramatics, and with its overall ambition in scale and size. I'm happy I went to go see this movie, and for so many others who do enjoy this movie, I think you should be allowed to, as long as you understand the things about the movie that probably are not good to think about when it comes to their overall message of that time period and glorifying the quote unquote old South. But if you tell me, if you think I'm wrong, put it in the comments down below. If I made you upset by this, I know I even have potentially individuals I know in life that would probably hear this and be like, oh, he's commenting on stuff he doesn't know. But like, do your history, do your research, and like, I just think it's important to say, because this is a movie that's never going to go away. It is still to this date the highest box office movie of all time when you adjust for inflation. It is very much, you can see the roots of Hollywood and blockbusters being built on that. And there's a lot of movies out there that you can say that have bad and not great messaging, things like The Godfather. We shouldn't really be glorifying a movie that is all about the mafia, right? And The Godfather is one of my favorite, if not my favorite movie. But that's a good place to end it. Again, if you like this stuff, like and subscribe. I'm going to try doing more classic movie reviews here once a month. But until then, check out my other reviews on the channel. And I'll see you next week when we talk about the next Civil War movie that comes out. Oh boy.
Where shall I go? What shall I do?
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.